Well, Terry Tanaka, I can't get into details right now. Let's just say I felt I was ready to retire from piloting deep-sea submersibles so I could spend more time researching prehistoric species like the megalodon. Jonas collected his notes. Now, if there are no other questions... Dr. Taylor? A balding man with tiny wire-rimmed glasses stood in the third row. He had bushy elfin eyebrows and a tight grin on his face. Please, sir, one last question, if I may. As you mentioned, the two manned expeditions into the Mariana Trench occurred in 1960, but, Professor, isn't it true that there have been more recent descents into the Challenger Deep? Jonas stared at the man. I'm sorry? Come now, Professor. You made several dives there yourself. Jonas was silent. The audience began to murmur. Back in 1989, Professor, while you were doing work for the Navy. I'm not sure I understand. Jonas glanced at his wife. You are Professor Jonas Taylor, aren't you? The man smiled smugly as the audience broke into light laughter. Look, I'm sorry. I really must be leaving now. I have another engagement. Thank you all for attending. A smattering of applause trickled out amid murmurs from the crowd as Jonas Taylor stepped down from the podium. He was quickly approached by students with questions, scientists with theories of their own. Jonas shook as many hands as he could, apologizing for having to run. The ponytailed man in the tuxedo squeezed his head through the swarming crowd. Hey, Jonas, the car is parked outside. Maggie says we need to leave now. Jonas nodded, finished signing a book for an admiring student, then hurried to the exit at the back of the auditorium where his wife, Maggie, was waiting impatiently. As he reached the door, he caught a glimpse of Terry Tanaka, looking at him from behind the moving crowd. Her eyes seemed to burn into his as she mouthed the words, "We need to talk." Jonas held up his watch and shrugged. He had had enough of the verbal assaults for one night. As if in response, his wife yelled through the exit door, "Jonas, let's go." They drove along the Coronado Peninsula in Bud Harris's limousine. Maggie stared coldly at Jonas. This is the biggest night of my career, and I had to practically drag you out of that lecture hall. Maggie, this was my first time back on the lecture circuit in over 2 years, and you come prancing down the aisle. Hey, whoa, guys! Bud held his hands up. Let's all just calm down a second. Maggie wasn't through. I've waited years for this opportunity, worked my ass off while I watched you flush your career down the toilet. Now it's my turn. And if you don't want to be here, that's fine by me. You can wait in the fucking limo. Bud will escort me tonight, won't you? Keep me out of this, said Bud. Maggie frowned and looked out the window. Tension hung in the air. After a few long minutes, Bud broke the silence. Henderson thinks you're a shoo-in. This really could be the turning point in your career, Maggie, assuming you'll win. Maggie turned to face him, managing to avoid looking at her husband. I'll win, she said defiantly. I know I'll win. Jonas Taylor had met Maggie almost 9 years earlier in Massachusetts, while he trained as a deep-sea pilot at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. Maggie had been in her senior year at Boston University, majoring in journalism. The petite blonde had at one time vigorously pursued a modeling career, but lacked the required height. She had reset her sights on making it as a broadcast journalist. Maggie had read about Jonas Taylor and his adventures in the Alvin submersible and thought he would be a good subject for the university paper. She knew he was a bit of a celebrity in his own right, and thought him handsome. Jonas Taylor was amazed that anyone like Maggie would be interested in deep-sea diving, or in him for that matter. His career had left him little time for a social life, and when the beautiful blonde seemed interested, Jonas jumped at the opportunity. They'd begun dating almost immediately. Maggie was impressed by the influence Jonas had among his colleagues in the field, and loved the excitement and adventure associated with ocean exploration. 10 months later they married and moved to California, where Jonas was contracted to work in conjunction with the U.S. Navy. Maggie loved California. In no time she became addicted to the celebrity life and longed for her own career in the media. With her husband's help, she knew she could break into the business. And then, disaster. Jonas had been piloting a new deep-sea submersible on a top-secret Navy expedition into the Mariana Trench. On his third dive into the abyss, he had panicked, surfacing the sub too quickly to decompress properly. 2 crewmen had died, and Jonas had been blamed for the accident. The official report had called it aberrations of the deep, and the accident destroyed Jonas's reputation as a reliable aquanaut. It would be his last expedition in a submersible. Maggy quickly realized that her ticket to stardom was in serious jeopardy. No longer able to cope with the stresses of deep-sea diving, Jonas became consumed with paleontology, writing books, studying prehistoric marine creatures. His income dwindled quickly, changing the lifestyle Maggy had grown accustomed to. She found herself part-time work as a freelance writer for a few local magazines, but it was all dead-end work. Her dreams of becoming a celebrity seemed over, her life suddenly unbearably boring. Then Jonas introduced her to his former college roommate, Bud Harris. Maggy was always looking for stories, and she and Jonas both thought Bud's shipping business would make an interesting article. Maggy spent a month trailing Bud around the harbor, with trips to his dock facilities in Long Beach, San Francisco, and Honolulu. The article she wrote became a cover story and made a local celebrity of the wild and woolly millionaire. His San Diego charter business boomed. Not one to forget a favor, Bud helped Maggy get a television reporting job with a local station. Now she was becoming a local celebrity. Bud climbed out of the limo, held a hand out for Maggy. They passed through the main entrance to the famous Hotel del Coronado, beneath a gold banner welcoming the 15th Annual San Diego Media Awards. Jonas recognized a few television people in the crowd, provincial stars from the local news. Harold Ray, the 54-year-old co-anchor of Channel 9 Action News at 10, smiled broadly as he said hello to Maggy. "You just may take home the Eagle tonight, Maggy." "What makes you think so?" "I'm married to one of the judges," Harold said, laughing. Eyeing Bud's ponytail, he asked, "Is this young man your husband?" "He's my executive producer," Maggy said, smiling. She glanced at Jonas. "This is my husband." "Jonas Taylor. Glad to meet you, Mr. Ray." "Professor Jonas Taylor?" "Yes." "Didn't we do a piece on you a couple of years ago? Something about dinosaur bones in the Salton Sea?" "You may have. There were a lot of news people out there. It was an unusual find." "Excuse me, Jonas," Maggy interrupted. "I'm just dying for a drink. Would you mind?" Bud raised a finger in the air. "A gin and tonic for me, pal." Jonas looked at Harold Ray. "Nothing for me, Professor. I'm a presenter tonight." Jonas made his way to the bar. The air was humid in the windowless ballroom, and Jonas's wool jacket felt prickly and hot. He asked for a beer, a glass of champagne for Maggy, and a gin and tonic. The bartender pulled a bottle of Carta Blanca out of the ice. Jonas cooled his forehead with it and took a long draught. He looked back at Maggy, who was still laughing with Bud and Harold. "Would you like another beer, sir?" The drinks were ready. Jonas looked at his bottle and realized that he had emptied it. "I'll have one of those," he said, pointing at the gin. "Me too," a voice said behind him. "With a lime." Jonas turned. It was the balding man with the bushy eyebrows. He peered over his wire-rimmed bifocals with the same tight grin on his face. "Fancy meeting you here, Doctor." Jonas regarded him suspiciously. "Did you follow me here?" "Heavens, no," the man replied, scooping up a handful of almonds from the bar. He gestured vaguely at the room. "I'm in the media." He put out his hand. "David Adeshek, with Science Journal." Jonas shook his hand warily. "I enjoyed your lecture tremendously. Fascinating about the mega... what did you call it?" Jonas sipped his drink, eyeing the reporter. "What is it you want, mister?" The man finished a mouthful of almonds and took a swig of his drink. "I was given to understand that 7 years ago you made some dives for the Navy in the Mariana Trench. Is that true?" "Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Why do you want to know?" "Rumor has it the Navy was looking for a site to bury radioactive waste from an aging nuclear weapons program. That's a story I think my editors would have a great deal of interest in." Jonas was stunned. "Who told you this?" "Well, no one told me exactly." "Who was it?" "I'm sorry, Professor, I don't reveal my sources." Jonas slowly shook his head and looked at the man. "I've got nothing to tell you. Now you'll have to excuse me. It looks like they've begun serving dinner." He turned, walking back toward his table. From the other side of the room, a pair of dark Asian eyes followed Jonas Taylor as he made his way across the ballroom, watching as he took a seat next to the blonde. 4 hours and 6 drinks later, Jonas stared at the golden eagle now perched on the white tablecloth, a TV camera clutched in its claws. Maggy's whale film had beat out a Discovery Channel project on the Farallon Islands and a Greenpeace documentary on the Japanese whaling industry. Maggy's acceptance speech had been largely a passionate save the whales plea. Her concern for the cetacean's fate had inspired her to make the film, she had said. Jonas had wondered if he was the only one in the room who didn't believe a word she was saying. They were all dancing now. Maggy had taken Bud's hand and led him onto the floor, knowing Jonas wouldn't object. How could he? He didn't like to dance. Jonas got up and walked to the bar. Harold Ray was there, picking up a bottle of wine and a pair of glasses. "So how was Baja, Professor?" Jonas momentarily wondered if Ray was drunk. "Excuse me?" "The cruise." "What cruise?" He handed his glass to the bartender, nodded for a refill. Ray laughed. "I told her 3 days was no vacation. Look at you. You've already forgotten." "Oh, you mean last week?" Then it hit him. The trip to San Francisco, the tan. "I'm afraid I didn't enjoy it as much as Maggy did." Jonas stared for a long moment at the glass in his hand, then scanned the dance floor for Maggy. The lights were low and couples were dancing close. He located Maggy and Bud clinging together like a pair of drunks. Bud's hands were caressing her back, working their way down. Jonas watched as Maggy absent-mindedly repositioned Bud's hands to her buttocks. Jonas slammed his drink down, then made his way awkwardly across the dance floor. They were still holding each other, lost to the world, their eyes dreamily closed. Jonas tapped Bud on the shoulder. He and Maggy stopped dancing and turned to Jonas. Bud stared at his friend, a look of apprehension coming over him. "Jonas?" Jonas let loose with a hard right to Bud's jaw. Several women screamed as Bud crashed into another couple and went sprawling to the floor. The band stopped playing. "Keep your hands off my wife's ass." Maggy looked aghast at Jonas. "Are you crazy?" Jonas rubbed his knuckles. "Do me a favor, Maggy. Next time you take a cruise to Cabo, don't come back." He turned and left the dance floor, the alcohol spinning the room as he strode toward the exit.